The Complete Survival Shelters Handbook, a step-by-step guide to building life-saving structures for every climate and wilderness situation. Okay. Contents, Introduction, the benefits of shelters. Chapter 1, Shelter Fundamentals. Shelter starts with good clothing, sleeping equipment, choosing a place to shelter, materials, making cord, making a hammer. Chapter 2, Making debris shelters with your bare hands. Natural shelter, rock shelter, debris hut, lean-to, stacked debris wall, round debris wall shelter, bent sapling shelter, subterranean shelter, snow shelter, improvements and basic furnishing, living in primitive shelters. Chapter 3, DIY and modern material shelters, emergency shelter bag, reflective foil blanket, Basha tarp shelters, Scandinavian lavu, gur or yurt. Chapter 4, modern store-bought shelters, hiking tents, hammocks, bivy bag, bell tent. Chapter 5, mental preparedness, drilling, understanding emotions and stresses, gaining confidence, adopting the right mental attitude. Index acknowledgments about the author. Introduction. This is a book about shelter, a subject regarded as the highest human priority, both in survival situations and modern life. In survival and bushcraft books covering the 4 basic human necessities, shelter, water, food, and fire, shelter will generally be the first topic covered in depth. This is because you can often survive a few days without water, fire, or food, but a lack of shelter can kill you within days, hours, or even in some cases, minutes. The human body on its own is surprisingly badly adapted to survive the vigors of life in all but the balmiest of climes, without help to regulate its own temperature. Modern aid and relief agencies recognize this fact by ensuring people in need immediately receive a form of shelter, whether during a natural disaster or refugee crisis. During my years of involvement with the shelter and primitive skills industry, I have often observed people wrongly prioritizing other needs above shelter. There seems to be a particular obsession about lighting a fire first. I have seen people spend hours upon hours failing to get a fire going. Lighting a fire without tools or accelerants is a difficult skill, especially during inclement weather, only to find themselves with too little daylight left to construct some form of shelter, resulting in a miserable night without shelter, food, fire, or water. I see the lure of starting a fire. There's nothing quite as comfortable or evocative of times gone as spending the night in front of a blazing fire with nothing but stars overhead. Though this notion may be romantic, it is also short-sighted. The fire may be hard to get going, draining limited energy reserves. Presuming it gets lit, it will require large amounts of fuel to last through the night, requiring more energy to gather, as well as a constant sense of awareness of when to add more wood to the fire, allowing you no more than a short slumber now and again, interrupted by regular panicked attempts to revive the inevitably dying fire. Spending the night with only a fire to protect you from the elements soon becomes a draining chore, depriving your body and mind of the rest, which is so undervalued yet incredibly important in a survival setting. The benefits of shelters. Shelter building may be a less glamorous skill than hunting for food or lighting that fire. But a good shelter will offer you many benefits, some of which may not be apparent at first. The shelter will protect you from the elements, whether they be cold, wet, or hot. A good shelter will be able to protect you from the lowest temperatures and the heaviest downpours. Just as the shelter will protect you from the weather, it will also serve to protect you from potentially dangerous animals living nearby. Your shelter will give you a place you can call home, a place to return to from your forays, a base to gather yourself together, and a focal point for your day-to-day life. It will allow you to focus on other activities, knowing that you have a refuge to return to. Your shelter has the ability to anchor you mentally. How can you be truly lost in a survival scenario when you have a shelter to house you and your possessions? A solid shelter is a tremendous tool to help you retain or regain a sense of control in unexpected scenarios. It can give you a feeling of well-being and increase your morale. A shelter will help attract potential rescuers in a survival setting by enlarging your footprint in an area when needed. Conversely, a well-designed shelter can lower your visibility where required, giving you a place to store valuable equipment and rest in safety. Shelters may be built using only natural materials without any need for tools or modern equipment, whereas many other skills require either tools or handmade materials. Lighting a fire using the bow drill method, for instance, requires the use of a sturdy string and a knife to carve the pieces. Shelter building uses mostly gross motor skills. You may be freezing with stiff fingers, but you should still be able to construct a decent shelter. Most other survival skills require fine motor skills and dexterity. Shelter building is a relatively easy skill to learn. By learning and understanding the principles, you can adjust your approach to suit most any environment. This last point has an enormous bearing on this book. Of course, I will not be able to cover every conceivable type of shelter in a book such as this, let alone cover each in sufficient detail to allow you to build them at home. Instead, I chose shelters that would demonstrate the range of shelters available, and most importantly, the principles behind shelter building. By showing you the principles at work, you will be able to come up with any type of shelter at will, perfectly suited to the environment you find yourself in, as well as your own level of skill, energy, and endurance. Also, I feel that shelter building in a survival setting, whether self-imposed or not, is in a constant state of evolution. You may start with the most basic of shelters, but over time you may well be adding on to the basic structure to improve it, or perhaps replace it altogether. You may start with a simple lean-to, perhaps creating walls a day later, or building a second one on yet another day. You might even decide to enclose your fire altogether with various structures on all sides. Learning individual types of shelter is not conducive to promoting a fluid evolutionary improvement on your campsite. Knowledge of the principles at work is needed. With this knowledge, the resources of your shelter site and time available to you will become your only limits.